The Oregon Trail, the long journey into the unknown. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we are going to take a slow journey into the distant American past, to a time when the roads were little more than trails, when a wooden wagon could become a family's entire world, and when the horizon seemed to stretch farther than anyone could imagine. So, wherever you are tonight, make yourself comfortable. Let the room become quiet. Let the day slowly disappear. And as you listen, imagine the soft sound of wagon wheels moving over the earth, the gentle creaking of wooden spokes, the quiet breathing of oxen beneath a wide evening sky, and the distant whisper of wind moving through the tall grass of the American frontier. There is no need to hurry. The journey itself is what matters tonight. Our story begins in the spring of the 1840s, when thousands of ordinary American families began looking westward. Beyond the familiar farms and small towns lay a vast country of open prairie, rivers, mountains, forests, deserts, and distant valleys. For many people, Oregon was almost an idea rather than a place. It was a name spoken beside fireplaces, a name printed in newspapers, a name carried through small communities by travelers returning from the West. Some described fertile valleys where crops could grow. Others spoke of forests so enormous that a person could walk beneath their trees for hours. There were stories of rivers filled with fish, open land, fresh air, and opportunities for families willing to travel far enough to reach them. But between the homes of the East and the valleys of Oregon was an immense distance. There were no paved highways. There were no railway stations carrying families directly across the continent. There were no modern hotels waiting beside the road. There were no convenient stores every few miles. Instead, there was the trail, and the trail was long, very long. A journey of many months, a journey measured not in miles alone, but in sunrise after sunrise, campfire after campfire, river crossing after river crossing. For a family preparing to leave, the decision was not a small one. They had to decide what could be carried and what had to be left behind. A wagon had limited space. A team of oxen could pull only so much. Every extra object meant additional weight. A heavy chest might contain memories from home, but it also made the animals work harder. A large piece of furniture might be precious, but there would be little room for it. So families sorted their possessions carefully: clothing, cooking utensils, blankets, tools, seeds, flour, beans, bacon, dried fruit, coffee, sugar, rope, a rifle, a kettle, a few books, perhaps a family Bible. Perhaps a wooden toy for a child, perhaps a small photograph or a letter that someone could not bear to leave behind. Everything had to earn its place. The wagon itself was usually a practical wooden vehicle covered by a white canvas or cloth top. From a distance, a long wagon train could look almost peaceful, white-covered wagons moving slowly through green grass, oxen walking steadily, people beside them. Children sometimes riding inside, dust rising softly behind the wheels. But the journey was not a vacation. The people traveling west understood that. They knew the trail would demand patience. They knew there would be sickness. They knew there would be storms. They knew rivers could rise suddenly. They knew mountains could be difficult. They knew that accidents happened. And yet, despite everything, they continued preparing, because the West represented possibility. For some, it was the hope of owning land. For others, it was the hope of escaping crowded communities or difficult economic circumstances. For some families, it was simply the desire to begin again somewhere beyond the familiar boundaries of the East. And so in the spring, wagons began gathering. Imagine one of those families tonight. Imagine a small farmhouse somewhere in Missouri. The morning air is cool. The sun has only recently risen. There is a smell of damp earth outside. Birds are calling from the trees. The family has been awake since before dawn. Their wagon stands in the yard. Its wheels have been checked. The canvas cover has been tied down. The oxen are waiting. A mother moves quietly between the house and the wagon. A father checks the harness. Children watch with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. For the children, the journey may seem almost like an adventure. They have heard adults discussing Oregon for months. They have imagined mountains. They have imagined rivers. They have imagined seeing places no one in their neighborhood has ever seen. But the adults understand something the children do not. Once the wagon begins moving west, there is no simple way to return. The old home will become smaller and smaller in memory. The familiar road will disappear behind them, the church, the neighbors, the fields, the trees. The small cemetery where relatives rest. Everything will slowly become part of the past. The family climbs into the wagon. The oxen begin to move. One slow step, then another. The wheels turn, wood creaks, leather straps move against the harness. The wagon rolls away from the house. For a moment, perhaps someone looks back. The farmhouse remains there in the morning light. Then the road bends, the trees hide it, and the journey west has truly begun. At first, the landscape is familiar. There are farms, fences, small settlements, churches, fields, streams, people traveling on horseback, other wagons moving in the same direction. The trail is not yet the lonely road that it will become. Instead, it is busy with movement. Families join larger groups, neighbors travel together, people who were strangers at the beginning gradually learn one another's names. There might be a blacksmith among them, a farmer, a carpenter, a teacher, a merchant, a young couple, an elderly man who has traveled west before, a mother carrying a baby. Children of different ages who soon discover that a wagon train is a very large playground. During the first weeks, excitement remains strong. The mornings begin early. Before sunrise, people are already moving around camp, fires are lit. Breakfast is prepared, animals are fed and harnessed, the wagons are loaded. Then, when the sun rises above the eastern horizon, the train begins moving. The pace is slow. Perhaps only a few miles pass in the first hours, then a few more. The animals cannot be rushed. They are the engines of the journey. Oxen especially are valued because they are strong, patient, and able to survive on grass along the route. They walk with a strange calmness. Their heads lower slightly. Their hooves press into the soil. Their breath rises in the cool morning air. The people walk too. Some travelers spend much of the day beside their wagons rather than inside them. Walking reduces the animal's burden. It also allows travelers to stretch their legs after sitting on rough wooden boards. Children, the trail offers endless things to observe. A rabbit disappearing into the grass, a hawk circling overhead, a distant herd of buffalo, wildflowers growing beside the path, a strange rock formation, an unfamiliar bird. At night, the world changes. The wagon train forms a rough camp. Wagons may be arranged in a circle or another practical pattern depending on the circumstances. Animals are secured. Fires appear one by one. Smoke rises into the evening. Dinner is simple. There is no restaurant, no dining room, no table covered with many choices. There is only what the family brought. Perhaps beans simmering in a pot, perhaps bacon, perhaps bread, perhaps coffee. The smell of food moves through the cool air. People sit together, some talk quietly, others are already tired. Children fall asleep. The adults discuss the next day, how far they might travel, where water might be found, whether the weather looks safe, whether an animal appears tired. The night sky is enormous. Without modern city lights, the stars appear bright, thousands of them, perhaps millions. The Milky Way stretches across the darkness like a pale river. For someone accustomed to a small town or farm, the sight can be overwhelming. There is no electric glow on the horizon, no traffic, no airplane lights, only darkness and stars. And somewhere beyond the firelight, the prairie continues. The wind moves through the grass. An animal shifts its feet. A wagon wheel gives a faint creak as the wood cools. Someone coughs. Someone whispers, then silence returns. The next morning, the journey continues, day after day, week after week. The landscape slowly changes. The familiar forests and farms give way to broader open country. The Great Plains begin to reveal themselves. At first, travelers may think the prairie is empty. But it is not empty. It is simply different from the places they know. The land seems almost endless. Grass moves in waves beneath the wind. The horizon remains far away. Clouds can be seen for enormous distances. Storms become visible long before they arrive. A dark line appears on the horizon, then slowly grows. The sky changes, wind rises, the animals become restless. Travelers secure loose belongings. The wagon covers are checked, then rain arrives, sometimes gently, sometimes with great force. The prairie can change quickly, a dry trail can become muddy, a shallow stream can become dangerous. Wheels sink, animals struggle, people push, ropes are tied, wagons are pulled, the journey becomes slower. But after the storm, the land may appear almost renewed. Drops of water shine on the grass, the air smells fresh. The sky opens, and once again the wagons move west. For the travelers, this rhythm becomes their new life: morning, travel, rest, evening, camp, sleep, morning again. There is something strangely peaceful about such repetition. The world becomes smaller in some ways. There are fewer decisions. The family knows what must be done: wake, cook, pack, walk, watch the animals, watch the weather, find water, make camp, eat, sleep, then begin again. And perhaps this is one reason the Oregon Trail remains so fascinating. It was an enormous journey, but much of it was made from very ordinary moments. A child walking beside a wagon, a mother washing a cooking pot beside a river, a father repairing a wheel, someone sewing a torn shirt, someone gathering dry wood, someone watching the sunset. The great history of the trail was built from these small moments. And tonight we will stay with those moments. We will follow the trail slowly across the plains, toward the Platte River, toward Fort Laramie, toward the high country, toward South Pass, toward the rivers and deserts farther west, and finally toward the green valleys of Oregon. But we will not hurry. Because the Oregon Trail itself was not a journey of hurry. It was a journey of patience, a journey where a mile could take an hour, a river could delay an entire group, a broken wheel could change the plans of a family, and where every evening brought the same question: where will we sleep tonight? For now, our wagon train is still near the beginning. The sun is setting across the prairie. The grass is turning gold. The shadows of the wagon stretch long across the ground. The oxen have stopped. The children are tired. A small fire burns beside the wagon. Above it, a kettle hangs quietly. Someone is preparing the evening meal. The wind moves gently through the grass. Far away, a coyote calls. No one knows exactly what tomorrow will bring. But tomorrow is still many hours away. Tonight, there is only the fire, the stars, the quiet prairie, and the long road waiting beyond the darkness. So let the wagon wheels rest. Let the oxen rest. Let the travelers rest. And as the fire slowly becomes smaller, imagine the great American landscape surrounding this tiny camp: miles of grass, distant hills, a darkening sky, and somewhere beyond the western horizon, Oregon, still far away, still unknown, still waiting. The journey has only just begun. The night passed quietly. For a few hours, the wagon camp became almost completely still. The small fires that had burned beside the wagons gradually turned into glowing beds of ash. From time to time, a piece of wood collapsed with a soft crack, sending a brief shower of sparks into the darkness. The oxen stood nearby, breathing slowly. The horses shifted occasionally. The prairie wind moved through the grass with a long, gentle sound. Inside the wagons, families slept beneath blankets. Some children slept deeply, unaware of the distance still waiting ahead. Others woke briefly during the night, hearing unfamiliar sounds outside, then closed their eyes again. Above them, the stars remained bright. There was something different about sleeping beneath such a sky. Back home, even on a clear night, darkness was never completely dark. There were houses, lanterns, windows, roads, nearby farms. But here, the darkness seemed to stretch in every direction. The travelers were surrounded by the immense continent. And somewhere within that darkness, the trail continued west. Morning eventually arrived. It began with a faint gray light in the east. Then the horizon slowly became pale. The stars disappeared one by one. Birds began calling. The prairie grass moved beneath the morning breeze. Someone rose from a wagon, then another person. Soon the camp began to wake. There was no alarm clock, no loud bell. The natural rhythm of the journey provided the schedule. People knew that another day of travel was waiting. A fire was started, coffee was prepared. Breakfast was simple, children were called awake. Blankets were folded, cooking equipment was packed. The animals were checked. An ox that seemed tired received special attention. A loose strap was repaired. A wheel was examined. The wagon train slowly transformed from a sleeping camp into a moving community. This was one of the remarkable things about the Oregon Trail. Every morning, an entire temporary town had to disappear. The camp existed for only one night. Then it was packed away. Nothing substantial remained. A few ashes, some footprints, wheel tracks, animal tracks, and perhaps a patch of grass where people had slept. Then the wagon train moved on. The travelers learned to live with very few possessions. The things they carried had to serve several purposes. A blanket was warmth at night. A cooking pot was essential for meals. A knife could cut food, rope, or wood. A piece of cloth might become a bandage. A strong rope could secure a load, repair equipment, or help pull a wagon from mud. Everything mattered. Nothing was easily replaced. Along the trail, a broken item was rarely just an inconvenience. A broken wheel could stop a family for hours. A damaged axle could become a serious problem. A lost animal could affect the entire journey, so maintenance became part of daily life. The wagon was checked again and again. Wooden components were inspected. Iron fittings were watched carefully. Wheels were kept in working condition. The travelers understood that the wagon was not simply transportation. It was their home, their storage room, their shelter, their kitchen, their sleeping place, their protection from rain and sun. And in many ways, the object upon which their journey depended. The trail itself was not a single perfectly marked road. It was a route shaped by thousands of travelers over time. There were ruts in the earth, wheel marks, occasional signs, natural landmarks, river crossings, known camping areas. Travelers depended heavily on experience and observation. The people leading a wagon train often had knowledge of the route. Some had traveled it before. Others relied on guidebooks, maps, or information gathered from previous travelers. But maps could not predict everything. A river might be higher than expected. A trail might be muddy. A familiar water source could be dry. A storm might change conditions. The landscape itself became their guide. A distant ridge, a river valley, a distinctive rock, a mountain, a grove of trees. In a world without modern navigation, these features were important. The sun also helped. Travelers could observe its movement across the sky. They could estimate direction. They could use familiar landmarks. And slowly, through repetition, the landscape became a kind of map. As the wagon train continued west, the Platte River became increasingly important. The Platte was one of the major rivers along the route. It stretched across the plains, providing water and forming a natural corridor through the landscape. Travelers often followed its general direction. From the wagon, the river could appear wide and quiet. Its water reflected the changing sky. Sometimes it seemed shallow, but rivers were never treated casually. Water levels changed. Currents could be stronger than they appeared. The banks could be soft. A wagon entering the wrong section might become stuck, so river crossings required planning. The wagon train would stop. People would examine the water. Animals would be prepared. Loads might be adjusted. Sometimes ropes were used. Sometimes wagons crossed individually. The process could take time. For modern travelers, crossing a river might seem like a minor event. For the pioneers, it could be one of the defining moments of a day. They had to trust the animals, trust the wagon, trust the person guiding them, and trust their own judgment. The Platte also provided a sense of companionship. For miles, travelers could see water beside the trail. The river was a reminder that they were moving through a living landscape. Birds gathered near it. Animals came to drink. Grass grew nearby. Trees were more common along the water. At the end of a long day, the river could provide a welcome place to camp. Imagine sitting beside it at sunset. The sky turns orange, then pink, then purple. The river becomes dark beneath the fading light. A family sits quietly beside the wagon. Someone washes a cooking pot. Someone fills a container with water. A child watches small insects moving above the surface. The adults speak softly. There is no need to talk constantly. The journey has made silence comfortable. A traveler might simply sit and look toward the horizon, perhaps thinking about the home that was left behind, perhaps thinking about the home that might someday be built in Oregon. The distance between those two ideas is difficult to imagine. The trail itself becomes the space between them. Behind them is the known world. Ahead is the unknown, and they are somewhere in between. As the weeks pass, the travelers begin to notice changes in themselves. At first, every new landscape is exciting. Later, some of the novelty disappears. The prairie seems endless, the same grass, the same sky, the same slow movement. But then suddenly something changes. A herd of animals appears. A line of distant hills rises ahead. A different type of plant grows beside the trail. The landscape reminds them that they are still moving. They are not standing still. The horizon is changing, even if slowly. The children adapt especially well. They learn the rhythm of the wagon train. They know when to help. They know where food is stored. They learn which adults are strict and which are more relaxed. They become familiar with the other children. A wagon train can create friendships quickly. Children who had been strangers at the beginning may spend weeks together. They walk beside the wagons. They collect interesting stones. They watch birds. They race one another for short distances. They tell stories. They invent games. Sometimes they become tired and ride inside a wagon. Then after resting, they climb down again. For adults, the journey is filled with responsibilities. For children, there is still room for curiosity. This contrast gives the trail a strange feeling. The landscape can be dangerous, but it can also be beautiful. A difficult day can still end beneath a spectacular sunset. A tiring journey can still contain moments of laughter. A family can be worried about the future, and yet enjoy a simple meal beside a river. Life does not stop being ordinary simply because the circumstances are extraordinary. That is perhaps one of the most human parts of the Oregon Trail. The pioneers were not characters in a legend while they were living their lives. They were simply people. They became tired, they became hungry, they became impatient, they laughed, they argued, they worried, they hoped, they missed home, they dreamed about the future. And then they woke up the next morning and continued. The farther west they traveled, the more they began to understand the size of the continent. The plains seemed to have no end. But gradually the land began to rise. In the distance, mountains appeared. At first they were barely visible, a faint blue line on the horizon. Someone might point toward them. A child might ask what they were. An adult might say that those were the mountains. The children would look again. The mountains seemed impossibly far away, but each day they became a little clearer, a little larger, a little closer. The journey was entering a new stage. The open plains would eventually give way to more difficult terrain. The wagon train would have to deal with slopes, rocks, narrow paths, higher elevations. The mountains represented another unknown. But before reaching them, there were still many miles to travel. And for now, the prairie remained beneath their wheels. The daily rhythm continued: wake, eat, pack, move, rest, move again, stop, camp, sleep. One day followed another. One sunset followed another. The journey became almost like a long meditation. There was so much repetition that travelers could lose track of individual dates. They remembered events instead. The day they crossed a difficult stream, the day a wheel broke, the day they saw buffalo, the day a storm soaked the camp, the day someone found a beautiful place beside the river. Time on the trail was measured by experiences, and gradually the road behind them became longer than the road they could see. One evening, after another long day, the wagon train stopped near the river. The sun was low, the animals were tired, the people were tired, but the weather was calm. A gentle breeze moved across the water. The travelers gathered around their fires. One family sat outside their wagon. The father looked west. Mother was preparing dinner. The children were lying on a blanket. Above them, the first stars began to appear. The father might have wondered how many more nights like this remained. Perhaps hundreds, perhaps fewer. No one could know exactly what the future held. But there was comfort in the simple things. The fire was warm. The food was cooking, the family was together, the river was flowing, the sky was clear. And for this one evening, everything was peaceful. The trail could wait until morning. The mountains could wait. The unknown could wait. Tonight, the family had reached the end of another day. And that was enough. Far beyond the camp, the prairie disappeared into darkness. The river continued quietly westward. The wind passed over the grass, the animals settled down. And beneath the enormous American sky, the pioneers slept. Tomorrow they would wake again. They would harness the oxen, they would load the wagons, they would follow the trail. And slowly, mile by mile, they would continue toward the unknown. The morning came softly. There was no sudden beginning to the day, only the gradual return of light. The eastern sky became pale, and then the first sunlight touched the tops of the distant grasses. A thin mist rested near the river. The wagon canvas looked almost silver in the early morning. Inside the wagons, people began waking. A child turned beneath a blanket. Someone coughed quietly. A mother opened the wagon flap and looked outside. The air was cool. For a moment, the camp was almost silent. Then came the familiar sounds. An animal moving, a harness buckle, footsteps, the crackle of a newly lit fire. Another day on the Oregon Trail had begun. By now, the travelers had learned that morning was a precious time. The cooler air made the first miles easier. The animals were rested. The ground was often firmer. And the sun had not yet become strong, so breakfast was prepared quickly. There was little reason to linger. A pot was warmed over the fire, coffee or another hot drink was prepared. Whatever food remained from the previous evening was eaten. Then the work of packing began. A wagon that had served as a bedroom only hours before became a carefully arranged load of supplies. Blankets were folded, cooking utensils were stored, barrels and sacks were secured, tools were placed where they could be reached. The canvas cover was checked, children were gathered, animals were harnessed. And slowly the camp began disappearing. The people who had slept there would leave almost nothing behind, the ashes of their fire. A few footprints, wheel marks, perhaps a broken twig. Then the grass would close over the traces. The trail moved on. As the wagon train traveled farther west, the landscape began to feel increasingly immense. The Great Plains were not empty, they were full of life. But the life was spread widely across the land. There were birds above, small animals in the grass, large herds moving in the distance, occasional trees beside water. The prairie had its own rhythm. The wind was perhaps the most constant sound. It could be gentle in the morning, strong in the afternoon, cool at night. It moved across the grass in waves. From inside a wagon, a traveler could watch those waves travel toward them, pass beneath the wheels, and continue behind them. Sometimes the prairie looked almost like an ocean. The grass became the waves. The distant horizon became the edge of the sea. And the wagon train seemed like a tiny vessel moving across an enormous green world. For people who had grown up among forests and farms, this landscape could be difficult to understand. There were few familiar boundaries. No walls, no large fences, no obvious roads. The sky dominated everything. Clouds were enormous. Storms were visible for miles. Sunsets could cover half the horizon. At night, the stars seemed close enough to touch. The travelers were learning a different scale of space, a place where one could walk all day and still feel as though very little had changed. Yet they were moving. The trail was carrying them toward the west. One important destination along the route was Fort Laramie. For many immigrants, reaching the fort was a meaningful milestone. It represented progress. The journey was still far from finished, but the travelers had crossed a significant portion of the plains. Fort Laramie also offered something the trail rarely provided, a place with established buildings, people who understood the traffic of the trail, supplies, information, a chance to rest and make repairs. Imagine the first sight of the fort after weeks of open country. The travelers might see structures ahead, something permanent, something that did not move with the wagon train. After so many days surrounded by grass and sky, even a simple building could seem impressive. People would talk, they would ask questions, they would exchange information. Which route was best? How were the rivers ahead? Was there enough grass? What was the condition of the trail? How difficult were the mountains? What had other travelers experienced? The Oregon Trail was also a moving network of information. Every wagon train carried stories. People met travelers coming from the opposite direction. They heard reports about places they had not yet reached. Sometimes the reports were encouraging, sometimes frightening, sometimes inaccurate. One person might say that the mountains were easy. Another might describe them as terrible. One traveler might say a particular river was simple to cross. Another might remember it differently. The farther west the wagon train traveled, the more dependent people became on shared knowledge. A stranger could provide useful information. A guide might become extremely valuable. An experienced traveler could save others from a poor decision. This was one reason wagon trains were often organized into groups. Traveling together offered practical advantages. There were more people to help with difficult tasks, more eyes to watch animals, more hands to repair a wagon, more experience to draw upon, and there was companionship. The trail could be lonely, but the wagon train itself was a community. People began to know one another's habits. They knew which family traveled quickly, which family took longer to prepare breakfast, which child was always running ahead, which person was skilled at repairing wheels, which person knew how to make a fire in wet weather. A traveling community developed its own character. There might even be moments of celebration, a birthday, a wedding, a successful crossing, the birth of a child, a beautiful evening. These moments mattered because the journey could otherwise become an endless repetition of work. People needed reasons to pause and remember that life was more than reaching Oregon. And so, on certain evenings, music might be heard. Someone could play an instrument, people might sing, children might dance. Laughter could spread through the camp. For a few minutes, the trail would feel less like a dangerous road and more like a traveling village. Then the music would end. The fire would burn lower. People would return to their wagons, morning would come, and the journey would continue. There were also difficult days. Not every morning was peaceful. Sometimes an animal became sick, sometimes a wagon broke, sometimes a family discovered that an important supply had been damaged. A wheel could crack, an axle could fail, a piece of harness could tear. These problems demanded immediate attention. The wagon could not simply be taken to a repair shop. The travelers had to become their own mechanics, woodworkers, blacksmiths, rope makers, problem solvers. A person who knew how to repair a wheel could become one of the most useful people in the group. A person skilled with animals could be equally important. A good cook mattered too. On a long journey, ordinary skills became valuable. The trail rewarded practical knowledge. A person who could improvise was often better prepared than someone who had carried many unnecessary possessions. This was another lesson the travelers gradually learned. The farther they went, the less interested they became in things that were merely decorative. Useful objects mattered, strong shoes mattered, warm blankets mattered, reliable tools mattered, food mattered, water mattered. Everything else became secondary. Some families had started the journey carrying possessions that seemed important at home. After weeks on the trail, those objects could become burdens. Travelers sometimes discarded items along the way: heavy furniture, extra clothing, broken equipment. Objects that had once been cherished. The trail forced people to decide what they truly needed. That decision could be painful. A family might leave behind something that had belonged to grandparents, but the wagon could carry only so much. The West demanded simplicity. As the wagon train approached the more rugged country, the landscape slowly changed. The horizon was no longer completely flat. Low hills began appearing. The trail rose and fell. The grass changed. Trees became more noticeable near streams. The travelers could feel that they were approaching something different. The mountains were getting closer. The distant blue shapes became more distinct. At sunset, they could sometimes see the outlines clearly. The mountains looked peaceful from a distance, blue, purple, almost unreal. But the travelers knew that the beauty concealed difficulty. They would soon have to climb. The animals would work harder. The wagons would move more slowly. The trail could become rocky. The weather could change. And beyond the mountains waited even more unfamiliar land. For now, however, the wagon train remained on the plains. The travelers continued along the Platte. The river remained beside them. Its presence offered reassurance. Water was one of the great necessities of the journey. Every traveler thought about water. Every animal needed it. Every meal depended on it. Every camp required it. A beautiful landscape without water could still be a dangerous place. So rivers became landmarks. They shaped the route. They determined where people could stop. They influenced decisions. The Platte was not always easy, but it was part of the trail. And for the immigrants, following it meant following a path already used by thousands of others. One afternoon, a young boy walking beside his family noticed something moving far across the grass. He stopped. His father stopped too. For several moments they watched. A herd of buffalo was moving in the distance, dark shapes against the green prairie. There were many of them, perhaps hundreds. The herd moved slowly, almost like a dark river across the land. The boy watched with wonder. He had never seen anything like it. His father explained what he could. The animals were enormous. Their bodies seemed powerful even from far away. They moved together, sometimes stopping, sometimes continuing. The boy would remember that sight for the rest of his life. This was one of the unexpected gifts of the trail. A person could leave home knowing almost nothing about the world beyond it and return with memories that would never disappear. They might see landscapes they had only heard about, animals they had never imagined, rivers larger than any river near home, mountains higher than anything they had seen, and skis that seemed endless. The journey was difficult, but it was also an education. The continent itself became the teacher. The trail taught patience. The weather taught caution. The animals taught responsibility. The rivers taught respect. The mountains would soon teach endurance. And the distance taught humility. No matter how strong a person felt, the landscape was stronger. No matter how carefully a family planned, nature could change those plans. The travelers could prepare, they could work, they could cooperate, but they could not command the weather. They could not move a mountain. They could not stop a river. They could only adapt. This was perhaps the central skill of the Oregon Trail: adaptation. The people who succeeded were not necessarily the strongest. They were often the people who could change their plans when circumstances changed. If the weather became dangerous, they waited. If an animal became tired, they slowed down. If a wheel broke, they repaired it. If a river was high, they looked for a safer crossing. The journey rewarded patience, and patience was difficult, especially when Oregon still seemed so far away. There were moments when travelers must have wondered whether they had made the right decision. Imagine a family sitting beside a campfire after a difficult day. The wagon is dusty, the animals are tired, someone has a sore foot, the meal is simple, the children are quiet, the mountains are visible in the distance. A person might think about home. Maybe the house they left behind was not perfect. Maybe life had been difficult there. But at least it was familiar. Here, everything is uncertain. Yet the next morning, the family wakes. They pack the wagon, they harness the oxen, they follow the trail. Because hope has a strange power. It can make a distant place feel closer than it really is. Oregon may still be hundreds of miles away, but in the minds of the travelers, it is becoming a real destination. They imagine land, they imagine a house, they imagine a garden, they imagine a quiet evening after the journey is over. And those imagined evenings help carry them through the difficult mornings. The sun begins to fall, another day ends. The wagon train makes camp. The animals are unharnessed, fires appear. Dinner is prepared. The sky becomes golden, then orange, then purple. The mountains in the distance become dark silhouettes. The river reflects the final light. People sit quietly, some speak, some simply watch. The journey has been long, but the evening is peaceful. The wind moves through the grass. The fire burns. A child falls asleep against a parent. Someone pulls a blanket over them. And for a little while, nobody thinks about tomorrow. Tomorrow will come soon enough. Tonight, there is only rest. The trail waits. The mountains wait. Oregon waits. And beneath the wide western sky, the travelers close their eyes. The next morning, the mountains seemed a little closer. They were still far away, rising in soft blue shapes beyond the plains, but their presence had changed the feeling of the journey. For weeks, the travelers had moved across open country. Now the land was beginning to suggest that something larger was ahead. The trail continued west. The wagons rolled slowly through the morning light. The wheels pressed into the earth, leaving 2 long tracks behind them. Oxen walked steadily. People walked beside the wagons. Children watched the mountains. The farther they traveled, the more often someone looked toward the horizon. There was curiosity there, and perhaps a little uncertainty. The mountains had always been part of the destination, but seeing them in person was different from hearing about them. They were real now, and soon the trail would have to cross them. For the moment, however, there were still miles of plains. The travelers continued along the Platte River. In places, the river widened. In other places, it became narrower. Its water changed color with the weather and the soil. Sometimes the river was calm beneath the morning sun. Sometimes wind roughened its surface. The river became a familiar companion. People learned where they could find good places to camp. They learned where the banks were easier to reach. They learned that water could never be taken for granted. Even a river that seemed peaceful could become dangerous when conditions changed. The Platte also gave life to the surrounding land. Grass grew thickly near the water. Birds gathered along the banks. Animals came to drink. Trees and shrubs appeared more often than they did on the open prairie. For travelers who had spent days surrounded by grass, these patches of greenery were welcome. A place with trees meant shade, it meant firewood, it meant shelter from the wind, it meant water nearby. A grove of trees could feel like a small gift from the landscape. The trail itself had become a familiar sight. Deep ruts crossed the earth. Thousands of wheels had passed over the same general route. Sometimes the travelers could see the tracks of previous wagons. They knew they were not the first. Others had traveled this way. Others had slept beside the same rivers. Others had watched the same mountains. Others had wondered what waited beyond them. There was comfort in that. The trail was unknown, but it was not completely unexplored. Every mile carried traces of the people who had gone before. The wagon train continued. During the afternoon, the sun became warm. The prairie seemed almost motionless. Only the wind moved. The oxen walked with the same patient rhythm, step, step, step. The wagon wheels creaked, step, step, step. Sometimes the sound became almost hypnotic. For the children riding inside the wagon, the movement could become soothing. The wagon swayed gently. Wooden wheels rolled over uneven ground. The canvas above filtered the sunlight. A child might lie beneath a blanket and listen to the sounds outside, the voices of adults, the footsteps of animals, the occasional creak of leather. The steady rhythm of travel. It was a very different kind of journey from modern travel. There was no engine, no radio, no road noise, no passing cars. The wagon moved at the pace of the animals. And because the pace was slow, the travelers had time to notice things. A bird flying overhead, a flower beside the trail, a cloud changing shape, a distant herd, a hawk resting on a tree, a rabbit crossing the road. Modern travelers often rush through landscapes. The pioneers could not. The landscape unfolded slowly before them. Every mile took time. Every hill had to be climbed. Every river had to be crossed. Every sunset had to be experienced. And so the journey became a long conversation between people and land. Sometimes the land was generous. Sometimes it was difficult. Sometimes it was beautiful. Sometimes it was frightening. But it always demanded attention. As the wagon train moved farther west, the travelers began preparing for the coming mountains. They checked their supplies. They examined the wagons. They made repairs. They looked at the animals. A strong team of oxen was essential. An exhausted animal could become a serious problem, so the travelers learned to pay attention to small signs. Was an ox moving more slowly? Was it eating normally? Did it seem injured? Was its harness causing discomfort? The animals were not machines. They were living companions. The success of the journey depended on their strength. A family could own the best wagon in the world, but without healthy animals, the wagon would not go anywhere. This made animal care one of the most important daily responsibilities. Water was carried whenever possible. Food for animals was found along the trail. Harnesses were adjusted. Hooves were watched. Rest was necessary. The pace of the journey had to be balanced. Too slow, and the group might struggle to reach the mountains before winter. Too fast, and the animals could become exhausted. The travelers had to find the middle ground. That balance was difficult, and it became more important as they approached higher ground. One evening, the wagon train stopped near a broad stretch of grass. The sun was setting behind the distant hills. A few travelers climbed onto the top of a small rise. From there, they could see farther west. The mountains were more visible now. Their shapes were becoming clearer. Some peaks were sharp, others were rounded. The colors shifted with the light, blue in the distance, purple beneath the evening sky, almost black where the sun could no longer reach them. Someone said they looked beautiful. Someone else said they looked difficult. Both were true. The mountains were beautiful, and they were difficult. For the pioneers, beauty and danger often existed together. A river could sparkle beautifully while carrying a powerful current. A forest could be peaceful while making travel difficult. A mountain could look magnificent while hiding steep slopes and rough terrain. The West did not separate beauty from hardship. It offered both at the same time. The travelers would learn this again and again. As darkness arrived, the camp settled. Dinner was prepared. The animals rested. The people gathered around the fires. A few stars appeared, then many more. The Milky Way became visible across the sky. Someone might have wondered how far away those stars were. The question would have been impossible to answer. The pioneers knew they were traveling into a huge world. But even they could not fully understand its scale. They could only experience it. The following days brought more signs of the approaching mountains. The ground became less flat. The trail began to rise gently. The wagon wheels moved over rougher surfaces. The animals worked harder. The travelers walked more carefully. Some people stayed beside the wheels, watching them closely. A damaged wheel on a rough slope could be dangerous. The wagons carried heavy loads. The descent could be especially difficult. Brakes were primitive. Animals had to control the weight. People sometimes had to help. Ropes could be used. Wooden stakes could help secure equipment. The journey demanded cooperation. One family might help another. A wagon could become stuck. Neighbors would stop, animals would be repositioned, people would push, ropes would tighten, someone would call instructions. Slowly, the wagon would move again. These moments created friendships. The trail was difficult to travel alone. Cooperation was not merely kindness, it was survival. A person who helped someone today might need help tomorrow. The wagon train was therefore more than a collection of families. It was a network of people who depended on one another. And despite disagreements, most understood that fact. The road ahead was too difficult to face entirely alone. As evening approached on one particular day, the wagon train reached a place where the land opened into a broad valley. The mountains surrounded it in the distance. The sight was breathtaking. The travelers stopped for a moment. Nobody needed to say much. They simply looked. After weeks of prairie, the mountains seemed enormous. Their slopes were covered with forests and shadows. Clouds rested near the highest peaks. The setting sun touched the upper ridges. Golden light spread across the valley. For a few minutes, the travelers forgot about the difficult road ahead. They forgot about sore feet. They forgot about broken wheels. They forgot about the weight of their supplies. They simply watched the landscape. One child asked whether Oregon was beyond those mountains. An adult answered that it was farther west. The child looked disappointed. Still farther, yes, still farther. The answer might have seemed strange. They had already traveled so far, yet the destination remained distant. The Oregon Trail had a way of making distance feel almost endless. But there was also something encouraging about that. Every difficult mile was a mile they would never have to travel again. Every day completed was one day closer to the destination. The journey could not be shortened. It could only be continued. And so, after the sunset faded, the travelers made camp. The wagons were positioned. The animals were cared for. A meal was prepared. The mountains became dark. The stars appeared. The night air was cooler here. People pulled their blankets closer. The sounds of the camp softened. A fire burned beside one wagon. A second fire burned farther away, then another. The lights of the camp formed a small chain beneath the mountains. From a distance, it might have looked peaceful. A few warm points of light surrounded by darkness. The people inside those circles of fire were tired, but they were together. And together they felt stronger. The night passed, morning came again. The mountains remained, the trail rose toward them, and the wagon train began moving. The plains were slowly becoming a memory. Ahead lay the next great stage of the journey, the Rocky Mountains. For the pioneers, the mountains represented a boundary. Beyond them was a different world. The trail would become narrower, the air would change, the land would become rougher. The journey would demand even more patience, but there was no turning back. The wagons continued west, the wheels turned, the oxen pulled, the travelers walked, and behind them the plains stretched toward the horizon. Ahead, the mountains waited quietly. They had been waiting long before the first wagon arrived, and they would remain long after the last wagon had passed. For now, though, the pioneers were approaching, slowly, quietly, 1 mile at a time. The first real slopes of the mountains arrived almost without announcement. There was no single moment when the prairie suddenly ended and the mountains began. Instead, the land changed gradually. The ground rose, the grass became different, the trail became rougher, small hills appeared more frequently. The wagons moved a little more slowly, and the travelers began to notice that the horizon was no longer an uninterrupted line. The mountains were becoming part of their daily world. In the mornings they could see them, in the afternoons they could see them. At sunset, they became dark silhouettes. Even at night, their presence could be felt in the cooler air. The wagon train continued west. The animals worked harder now. Oxen lowered their heads and leaned into the harness. Their hooves pressed firmly into the ground. The wooden yokes rested across their shoulders. Every step required effort. The travelers understood that. They did not want to exhaust the animals, so the pace remained slow, very slow. Sometimes a person walking beside the wagon could cover the same distance in less time. But the wagon could not move faster than the animals could safely pull it. The journey had to follow the strength of the team. The mountains taught patience immediately. A slope that looked small from a distance could take considerable time to cross. A wagon might climb for an hour and seem to have moved only a short distance. The wheels creaked. The animals breathed heavily. People walked beside them. Sometimes they pushed. Sometimes they held ropes. Sometimes they simply watched. The trail became a place of constant attention. A loose wheel could become dangerous. A broken harness could delay the entire group. A heavy load could make a climb harder. Travelers began to think carefully about weight. Every pound mattered. The wagon that had seemed manageable on the plains now felt heavier. Some families had already abandoned unnecessary possessions. The mountains made that decision even easier. If something was not essential, it might not be worth carrying. A traveler might look at a heavy object that had been carefully packed months earlier and realize that it had become a burden. The trail changed people's relationship with possessions. At home, an object might have represented comfort. On the trail, comfort had to be balanced against weight. The journey demanded practicality, and so the wagon became simpler. The important things remained: food, tools, clothing, blankets, cooking equipment, medicine, weapons, seeds, personal items with deep meaning. Everything else became negotiable. The landscape itself seemed to encourage this simplicity. There was no room for unnecessary decoration. The mountains cared nothing for possessions. They cared only about movement. The travelers continued upward. Trees appeared more often. Pines and other mountain trees stood along slopes and near streams. The smell of the forest was different from the smell of the prairie. There was the scent of wood, damp soil, needles, fresh air. For travelers who had spent weeks under an open sky, the trees created a new kind of environment. The mountains could feel enclosed. The horizon disappeared behind slopes. Instead of seeing for miles, travelers could sometimes see only the trail immediately ahead. This was both comforting and unsettling. The open prairie had allowed travelers to see storms and distant movement. The mountains hid things. A bend in the trail could conceal what came next. A narrow valley might reveal itself only after the wagon entered it. The landscape demanded trust. Trust in the trail, trust in experienced guides, trust in the people traveling beside them, and trust in the animals. One afternoon, the wagon train stopped near a mountain stream. The water was cold and clear. Travelers filled containers. Some washed their faces. Children knelt near the edge. The water rushed over stones with a gentle, constant sound. After the dry openness of the plains, the stream felt refreshing. The travelers sat beneath the trees. For a short while, they did not think about distance. They simply rested. A mother might rinse a cloth. A child might examine a smooth stone. Someone might collect fallen branches for the evening fire. The forest provided shade. The stream provided water. The mountains surrounded them. It was a beautiful place to stop. But the travelers knew they could not stay. The trail was still waiting. Eventually, the animals were harnessed again. The wagon train moved on. As the afternoon progressed, the trail became steeper. The people walking beside the wagons could hear the animals breathing. The wheels turned slowly. Sometimes the wagon stopped completely. Everyone waited. Perhaps a team needed to rest. Perhaps a wheel needed adjustment. Perhaps another wagon was blocking the trail. The mountains forced the wagon train to move as one. On the plains, a family could spread out. In difficult terrain, they had to stay closer together. The trail narrowed. There was less room for mistakes. A wagon too close to the edge could be dangerous. A poorly placed wheel could cause trouble. People watched one another carefully. The strongest animals were sometimes used to help with difficult sections. Extra ropes might be attached. People worked together. The process was slow, but slowly it worked. One wagon moved, then another, then another. The train continued. By evening, the travelers reached a relatively level place. It was not a perfect campsite. But after a difficult climb, almost any flat ground felt welcome. The animals were unharnessed. The wagons were secured. Fires were built. The temperature had dropped. Mountain nights were colder than the plains. People wrapped themselves in blankets. Dinner was prepared. The meal was simple. But after a day of climbing, simple food could taste wonderful. A traveler might sit beside the fire holding a warm cup. The flames would reflect in tired eyes. Above the camp, the mountains disappeared into darkness. The sky seemed even clearer here. Stars filled the spaces between the peaks. The Milky Way stretched across the darkness. The firelight created a small circle of warmth. Beyond that circle was the mountain night. The forest made different sounds. Branches moved. An animal called somewhere in the distance. Wind passed through the trees. The travelers listened. Some were nervous. Others were simply tired. Eventually, conversation faded. One by one, people went asleep. The next morning brought another challenge. A steep section of trail waited ahead. The wagon leaders studied it. They looked at the ground. They looked at the animals. They considered the loads. The safest route was chosen. The wagons began climbing. This was not a journey that could be rushed. A single mistake could cause serious trouble. The travelers stayed close. Some walked behind the wagons. Others walked beside the wheels. They watched carefully. If a wheel slipped, they were ready. If an animal stumbled, they were ready. If a rope broke, someone moved quickly. The entire group became focused. The world narrowed to the trail. Nothing else mattered. Step by step, wheel by wheel, the wagons climbed. At the top of a difficult slope, the travelers stopped. They turned and looked back. The view was enormous. The plains stretched behind them, far in the distance. The route they had traveled disappeared into the horizon. Somewhere back there were the rivers they had crossed, the camps where they had slept, the places where they had repaired wagons, the people they had met, the difficult days, the peaceful evenings. All of it was behind them. From this height, the distance was easier to understand. They had traveled far, very far. The thought could be both comforting and frightening. They had made progress, but there was still much farther to go. One traveler might have looked back toward the east and wondered how the old home would look now. Would the house still be there? Would the fields look the same? Would the neighbors remember them? Would they ever return? For many immigrants, the answer would eventually be no. The journey west was becoming permanent. The trail was carrying them toward a new life. At the top of the ridge, the wind was stronger. The air was cool. The travelers stood quietly. Then someone called that it was time to continue. The wagons began moving again. The view disappeared behind them. The trail descended. Going downhill created its own difficulties. The weight of the wagon pushed forward. The animals had to control the descent. People used ropes and other methods to help. Wheels were watched carefully. A runaway wagon was a terrifying possibility. So everyone remained alert. Slowly, the wagons descended. At the bottom, the travelers reached another valley. A stream ran through it. Grass grew near the water. The animals could rest. The travelers could breathe. The day was almost over. They made camp. This time, the evening felt different. The mountains were no longer distant. They were all around. The travelers had entered their world. And yet there was beauty in it. The evening light touched the slopes. The forest became dark green. The stream reflected the sky. A bird called from somewhere above the camp. The pioneers sat beside their fires. They were tired. But there was also a sense of accomplishment. They had climbed. They had crossed. They had continued. Tomorrow would bring another stretch of trail, but tonight they could rest. The children slept quickly. Adults spoke quietly. Someone repaired a piece of harness. Someone checked the wagon. Someone looked at the stars. The fire slowly became smaller. The mountain air grew colder. A blanket was pulled closer. And eventually the camp became quiet. The Oregon Trail was still long. The unknown was still ahead. But the travelers had crossed one of the great boundaries of the journey. The mountains had no concern for their destination. They did not hurry them. They simply stood, silent, ancient, unmoving. And beneath those mountains, the wagon train slept. Morning arrived in the mountains with a different kind of quiet. The sun did not immediately reach the valley floor. The mountains held the early light above the camp, leaving the wagons in cool shadow. A thin layer of mist rested near the stream. The animals stood quietly, their breath visible in the cold air. For a few minutes, the camp seemed almost suspended between night and day. Then someone began preparing the fire. A small flame appeared. Soon there was smoke. Then the familiar smell of coffee and breakfast drifted through the camp. The travelers rose. Another day had begun. The mountain trail ahead was not easy. Everyone knew that. The previous day had already shown them how much slower travel could become. But the journey had to continue. The animals were fed. Harnesses were checked. Wagons were inspected. The travelers looked carefully at the wheels. The wooden spokes had endured many miles. The rough ground could damage them. A wheel that looked fine in the morning could become a problem by afternoon. So every part of the wagon received attention. The wagon was their home. They treated it almost like another member of the family. When everything was ready, the train began moving. The sound of wheels returned. The forest gradually opened. The trail climbed. At times it followed a stream. At other times it crossed rocky ground. The wagons moved slowly. The people walked beside them. The mountains seemed to rise on every side. The air felt thinner and cooler. The vegetation changed as the elevation increased. Some trees became smaller, the open spaces between them widened. The travelers were entering higher country. For the first time, some of them could see snow remaining on distant peaks even though the season was warm. The sight was strange, snow in summer. White against dark mountain slopes. The children pointed toward it, the adults looked too. It was another reminder that the mountains followed different rules from the plains. Weather could change quickly. Sunlight could be warm in one place and cold only a short distance away. The travelers had to be prepared. A person who began the morning without enough warm clothing could regret that decision by evening. The trail continued upward. The wagons moved one after another. Sometimes the group stopped to rest. The animals needed it. The people needed it. There was no point in forcing progress when exhaustion would create greater problems later. Patience remained the rule. The mountains could not be negotiated with. They could only be crossed. During one pause, a group of children wandered near a small meadow. They found tiny flowers growing between rocks. The children gathered around them. One child wondered how such delicate flowers could survive in such a harsh place. An older traveler explained that the mountains had their own seasons and their own forms of life. The flowers had adapted. The animals had adapted. The people had to adapt too. The child listened. Then the wagon train began moving again. The meadow disappeared behind them. As the day progressed, the trail became steeper. The wagon leaders watched every turn. A wrong turn could lead to a dangerous slope. The route had been used by previous travelers, but it was not always obvious. Ruts and wheel tracks helped. So did natural landmarks. Experienced guides paid attention to the shape of the land. They knew that certain valleys led in the right direction. They knew where water could be found. They knew which slopes were manageable. Without such knowledge, the journey would have been even harder. The travelers depended on one another. A wagon became stuck. Several people stopped. Ropes were attached. Animals were positioned. The travelers pulled. The wagon moved slightly, then stopped again. Everyone waited. The animals were allowed to breathe. The people adjusted the ropes. Then they tried again. Slowly, the wagon moved forward. A cheer might have gone through the group, not because they had achieved something enormous, but because on the Oregon Trail, small victories mattered. A wagon unstuck was a victory. A safe river crossing was a victory. A repaired wheel was a victory. A healthy animal at the end of a difficult day was a victory. The journey was built from hundreds of these small successes. By late afternoon, the trail began to level. The travelers had reached a broad, high valley. The view opened again. Mountains surrounded them, but the land ahead was more manageable. The wagon train stopped. Everyone was tired. The animals were tired. The travelers decided to make camp early. There was no need to push farther. A good campsite had been found. There was water. There was grass. There was enough wood, so the work began. The animals were unharnessed. The wagons were positioned. Fires were started. People prepared food. The children played quietly nearby. For the first time that day, the travelers could relax. The evening light spread across the valley. The mountains became golden, then orange, then red. Eventually, the sunlight disappeared. The temperature fell. The stars appeared. The valley became dark. A fire burned beside one wagon. Someone sat near it with a blanket around their shoulders. Another traveler was repairing a shoe. A child slept beside a parent. The ordinary details of life continued, even in the middle of the mountains. Even during a journey that would become part of American history, people still had to eat. They still had to sleep. They still had to repair things. They still had to care for children. History was happening quietly, one evening at a time. The next morning, the wagon train continued. The travelers were now approaching one of the most important geographical features of the entire journey, South Pass. South Pass was not a narrow mountain pass in the dramatic sense many people might imagine. Instead, it was a broad, relatively gentle passage through the Rocky Mountains. Its importance was enormous. The route allowed wagon trains to cross the Continental Divide without having to climb an extremely steep mountain wall. For travelers, reaching South Pass meant something important. They had crossed a major barrier. The route ahead would still be difficult. There would be deserts, rivers, mountains, and many more challenges. But the Rocky Mountains themselves were largely behind them. As the wagon train approached the pass, people began looking west with a different feeling. They had spent weeks moving toward these mountains. Now they were nearing the point where the trail would carry them beyond them. The landscape became increasingly open. The mountains seemed to spread around a broad passage. The air was cool, the sky enormous. The travelers walked quietly. There was a sense of anticipation. They knew the pass was important. Some might have heard stories about it before leaving home. Now they were actually there. A family stopped at a high point. The father looked back. The mother stood beside him. The children looked around. Behind them were the mountains they had crossed. Ahead was the land leading toward the Great Basin and eventually the country beyond. The father might have said something simple. "We made it this far." Those words could carry enormous meaning. Months earlier, Oregon had been a distant dream. Now they had crossed the plains. They had crossed the Rockies. They were still far from their destination. But the journey had already transformed them. They were no longer the same people who had left home. They had learned how to travel, how to live with little, how to work together, how to sleep outside, how to read weather, how to care for animals, how to repair a wagon, how to wait, how to continue. The trail had changed them. The wagon train moved through South Pass. There was no dramatic ceremony, no great gate, no sign announcing that a major chapter had ended. The travelers simply kept moving. That was how the trail worked. One landmark passed, then another. One challenge completed, then another appeared. There was never a moment when the journey suddenly became easy. But there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the mountains were behind them. The road now led toward the west, and the west looked different. The landscape beyond the pass was more open again. But it was not the same prairie they had left behind. The land was drier. Vegetation was more sparse. The travelers would soon learn that water could become even more important. The mountains behind them slowly faded. The wagons descended. The air changed. The horizon opened. For a while, the travelers might have believed that the hardest part was over. But the journey still had many surprises. The trail would soon lead them through country they had never imagined. Dry valleys, rocky landscapes, wide deserts, new rivers, new mountains, and eventually the green country of Oregon. For tonight, however, they could rest with one comforting thought. They had crossed the Rockies. The great mountains that had seemed so distant were now behind them. The wagon train stopped in the evening. The animals grazed. The people prepared dinner. The sun disappeared behind the western horizon. The mountains behind them became dark. Ahead, the sky remained faintly illuminated. A soft glow lingered over the distant land. The travelers sat quietly. Perhaps someone looked back one final time. The mountains were silhouettes now, beautiful, dark, still. Then the traveler turned west. The fire crackled, the night deepened, the children slept. The wagon stood quietly beneath the stars. The journey continued tomorrow, but tonight there was rest. And for a little while, the unknown ahead could remain exactly where it was, far away, beyond the darkness. The morning beyond the mountains felt strangely open. The travelers woke beneath a sky that seemed wider than it had the previous evening. Behind them were the Rocky Mountains. Ahead lay country that many of them had never seen before. The trail continued westward. The wagons began moving. For the first few hours, the travelers felt almost relieved. The difficult mountain climbs were behind them. The animals seemed to move more comfortably on the gentler ground. The wagons rolled steadily. The trail stretched across the open landscape, but the land ahead was becoming drier. The green grass of the plains was fatting. The travelers began to understand that the mountains had not been the final challenge. They had only been one chapter. The west still had many different landscapes waiting for them. The country beyond South Pass was often dry and open. Water became a greater concern. The travelers watched the landscape carefully. A distant line of trees could mean water. A green patch beside the trail could suggest a stream. A low valley might contain a spring. People began asking questions. Where was the next reliable water source? How far away was it? Would there be enough for the animals? Could the wagon train reach it before evening? Water had always mattered. Now it mattered even more. The animals needed it. People needed it. Cooking depended on it. And without healthy animals, the wagons could not continue. The travelers began carrying water whenever they could. Every container became important. A small amount of water might mean the difference between comfort and hardship. The landscape looked peaceful. That was part of its danger. There were no dramatic signs announcing that the land was difficult. The sun simply became stronger. The grass became thinner, the air became dry. The wind carried dust. The travelers learned to protect themselves from the sun. Hats were worn, clothing was adjusted, water was used carefully. Travelers tried to move during the cooler parts of the day. The trail was now entering the Great Basin region. The mountains were not completely gone, they appeared in the distance, separated by broad valleys, but the character of the land had changed. The country felt more isolated. The travelers could go for long distances without seeing settlements. The sense of distance became stronger. There was no familiar town ahead, no nearby farm, no store, no blacksmith, only the trail, the wagons, the animals, the sky, and the landscape. At night, the silence felt especially deep. There were fewer sounds. The wind moved across dry grass, small animals made occasional noises, a campfire crackled, the travelers spoke quietly, then the darkness returned. One evening the wagon train stopped near a small stream. It was not a large stream, but to the travelers it felt precious. The animals drank, people filled containers, the families washed their faces. Some children played beside the water. The adults knew they could not waste it. They had learned that the trail could offer abundance one day and scarcity the next. The stream became the center of the camp. People gathered around it. The fire was built nearby. Dinner was prepared. The evening was peaceful. A traveler sat beside the water and watched the sunset reflected on the surface. The sky turned orange, then pink, then purple. The mountains in the distance became dark. The stream continued flowing. For a few minutes, the journey felt almost like a peaceful retreat. Then someone reminded the group that they had to leave early. The next stretch of trail would be long. The travelers prepared for the morning. The journey continued. The days became warmer. The land became drier. Dust gathered on clothing. Dust settled on the wagons. Dust covered the animals. After weeks of travel, everyone was accustomed to it. The white wagon covers were no longer perfectly white. Clothes were worn. Shoes were worn. Hands were rough. Faces were darker from the sun. The travelers looked different from when they had left. The trail had marked them, but it had also made them stronger. They had become experienced travelers. A person who had once been frightened by a broken wheel now knew how to repair it. A child who had never ridden beside an ox now knew how to handle one. A mother who had never cooked outside now knew how to prepare meals over a small fire. A father who had never studied a wagon axle now knew exactly what to look for. The journey had turned ordinary people into practical experts. They had learned by doing. There had been no school for this. The trail itself was the teacher. One afternoon, the travelers noticed a group of animals moving across the distant landscape. The sight brought excitement. Wild animals were a constant reminder that the country was still largely undeveloped. The travelers watched quietly. Then the animals disappeared beyond a ridge. The wagon train continued. Sometimes the landscape seemed almost empty. But empty was not the right word. The land was alive. It simply operated at a slower, quieter rhythm. Small plants grew in dry soil. Insects moved beneath rocks. Birds crossed the sky. Animals traveled long distances in search of water and food. The pioneers were learning to see these things. The longer they stayed on the trail, the more observant they became. They learned where animals might gather. They learned how to recognize signs of water. They learned how clouds could indicate weather. They learned that the color of the landscape could change with the season. The journey was teaching them to read the land. One evening, a storm appeared in the distance. The sky darkened. Clouds gathered over the mountains. Wind began moving across the valley. The travelers watched carefully. A storm could bring rain, but it could also bring strong wind and sudden temperature changes. The wagon covers were secured. Loose items were tied down. Animals were moved closer. Then the first drops began to fall. The rain was light at first, then stronger. The dry ground darkened. Dust disappeared. The air became cooler. The travelers stood beneath the wagon covers. Rain tapped against the canvas. For a while, the entire world seemed to consist of water and sound. Tap, tap, tap. The animals shifted beneath the rain. The wagon canvas flexed in the wind. Children listened quietly. Then, just as suddenly as it had arrived, the storm began moving away. The clouds opened. A strip of light appeared on the horizon. The rain stopped. Water remained in small pools across the ground. The air smelled fresh. The travelers stepped outside. The landscape looked different for a brief moment. The desert-like country seemed green and alive. The storm had changed everything. The travelers appreciated the rain, but they also knew that wet ground could make travel difficult, so they waited until conditions improved. Again, patience. The next morning, the trail was damp. The wagons moved carefully. Mud clung to the wheels. The animals worked harder. But the weather was cooler. The travelers welcomed that. Every challenge had a positive side. The heat had been reduced. The dust had settled. The air was clean. As the day continued, the ground gradually dried. The wagons moved more easily. The journey continued. One of the most difficult parts of the trail was not always the landscape itself. It was the uncertainty. A traveler could not know exactly what tomorrow would bring. There might be good water. There might be difficult terrain. There might be a broken wheel. There might be a beautiful campsite. There might be a storm. There might be sickness. There might be nothing unusual at all. The unknown was part of every day. This uncertainty made the simple things more valuable. A good meal, a calm night, a healthy animal, a working wagon, a clear trail. These were not small things anymore. They were reasons to be grateful. At night, families sometimes talked about Oregon. They imagined what their new homes might look like. Would they build a wooden house? Would they plant an orchard? Would they raise animals? Would they grow wheat? Would they live near a river? Would they have neighbors? The possibilities were endless. The future existed mostly in their imagination. They could not see it yet. They could only picture it. A child might imagine a large garden. A father might imagine fertile farmland. A mother might imagine a quiet home where her children could grow up safely. Everyone had a different picture, but the destination was shared: Oregon. The word had traveled with them for months. It was becoming almost like a promise, still distant, still uncertain, but real enough to keep moving toward. The wagon train continued west. The landscape gradually began to change again. In the distance, new mountains appeared. The travelers would have to cross more difficult terrain. But these mountains were not the same as the Rockies. The route would eventually lead them toward the Snake River country and the Columbia River. The names might have sounded familiar from guidebooks and stories, but names could not describe what it was like to stand there. The travelers would have to experience it themselves, for now. They continued through the dry country. The sun moved across the sky. The wagons moved beneath it. The animals walked. The people walked. The trail stretched ahead. By evening, another camp was established. The fire was small. The food was simple. The travelers were tired, but the sky was clear. Stars appeared. The desert night became cool. The family gathered close to the fire. Someone spoke softly about how far they had traveled. Someone else calculated how much farther remained. Nobody knew exactly. The trail did not provide certainty. It provided direction, west, always west. And so beneath the quiet stars, the travelers rested. The next morning would bring another mile, then another, and another. The long journey continued into the unknown. The days beyond the mountains began to blend together: morning light, wagon wheels, dust, long stretches of quiet land, a river or stream whenever one could be found. Then evening, a small fire, a simple meal, sleep, and morning again. For the pioneers, time had become something measured by movement. They did not need to ask what day it was. They knew where they were by the landmarks they had passed. They knew the season by the temperature. They knew how much of the journey remained by the supplies in their wagons. Every morning brought another calculation. How much food remained? How much water? How strong were the animals? How much farther could they travel today? The farther west they went, the more important these questions became. The trail was no longer simply a road toward Oregon. It had become a test of endurance. Yet there were moments of extraordinary beauty. One morning, the sun rose through a thin layer of mist. The wagon train was traveling across a broad valley. The mountains in the distance were barely visible. The light slowly touched their slopes, first gray, then blue, then gold. The travelers stopped briefly. Nobody had planned to stop. There was simply something about the morning that made everyone quiet. A child stood beside the wagon and watched the sunlight spread across the valley. The grass glittered with moisture. Birds moved through the air. The animals stood calmly. For a moment, the journey seemed almost peaceful. Then the wagons moved again. The trail always called them forward. One of the greatest challenges of the western journey was the rivers. After crossing the plains and passing through the mountains, the immigrants would encounter new waterways. Among them were the Snake River and eventually the Columbia. Rivers could be beautiful, they could also be unpredictable. A crossing had to be approached carefully. The depth of the water mattered, the current mattered, the condition of the banks mattered, the weight of the wagon mattered, the strength of the animals mattered. A crossing that looked simple from a distance could become difficult once the wagon entered the water. The travelers knew this. So when they approached a river, the mood changed. People became more attentive. Conversations became shorter. The animals were checked. Loads were secured. Everyone watched the water. A river crossing was not something to rush. The wagon train might stop for a long time. Someone would inspect the best place to cross. The group might wait for another wagon. Experienced travelers would explain what to do. Then, one by one, the wagons would approach. The first wagon entered the water. The oxen stepped forward. Water rose around their legs. The wagon wheels entered next. The current pushed against them. People watched closely. The wagon moved slowly. The animals continued. Step by step, the wagon reached the opposite bank. The group breathed more easily. Then the next wagon began, and another. The process could take hours. But eventually the entire train would be across. The river would remain behind them. The trail would continue. These crossings became important memories. Years later, someone might remember a particular river simply because of the way the sunlight looked on the water, or because a wheel became stuck, or because a child was frightened, or because the whole family celebrated after reaching the other side. The trail was full of such memories. It was not only a journey through geography, it was a journey through moments. One afternoon, the wagon train reached a broad section of the Snake River country. The landscape was rugged. Dark volcanic rocks appeared in places. The land seemed older here. The travelers moved carefully. The wagons had already endured hundreds of miles. The wheels had been repaired many times. The wood had been exposed to rain, sun, dust, and cold. Every mile added wear, yet the wagons continued. The people continued too. There was something almost stubborn about their progress. The destination was distant. The journey was difficult, still they moved. This persistence was one of the defining characteristics of the Oregon Trail. No single day was necessarily heroic. Most days were ordinary, but hundreds of ordinary days could produce something extraordinary. A family could travel farther than they had ever imagined simply by waking each morning and continuing. There were no shortcuts, no fast routes, only steady movement, step, step, wheel, wheel west. As the travelers entered the Snake River region, they began to encounter more rugged terrain, cliffs, canyons, dry hills, rocky slopes. The trail sometimes followed the river, sometimes it moved away from it. The travelers learned to watch the landscape carefully. A narrow trail beside a steep drop could make everyone nervous. The wagons were guided slowly. People walked beside them. No one wanted to take unnecessary risks. The animals sensed the difficulty too. They moved carefully. Their hooves searched for solid ground. A traveler might reach out and touch an ox's side, quietly encouraging it forward. The bond between people and animals had grown stronger over the months. The animals were no longer simply equipment. They were familiar companions. The travelers knew their personalities. Some were stubborn, some were calm. Some responded quickly, some required more patience. When an animal became sick or injured, the family felt it deeply. The journey depended on them. A wagon train without healthy animals could not continue, so care for animals remained part of every evening: water, food, rest, inspection. The travelers learned to recognize exhaustion. They understood that forcing an animal beyond its strength could create a greater problem later. Again, patience. The trail constantly taught the same lesson in different forms. Do not rush, pay attention, work together, continue. One evening, the wagon train stopped beside a quiet section of river. The sunset was unusually beautiful. The water reflected the sky. The cliffs turned orange, then red, then dark purple. The travelers stood beside their wagons. Some children sat on the ground. The animals grazed nearby. A breeze moved through the grass. Someone began preparing dinner. The smell of food spread through the camp. The day had been difficult, but the evening was peaceful. This contrast was common on the trail. A hard day could end beautifully. A beautiful morning could become difficult by afternoon. Nothing remained the same for long. The travelers learned to accept that. They did not expect every day to be good. They simply hoped to reach the end of each day safely. That was enough. After dinner, the stars appeared. The river became dark. The cliffs disappeared into shadow. A fire burned near the wagons. The travelers sat around it. Some spoke about the journey. Others remained silent. One older traveler might have told stories about earlier sections of the trail. He might remember the plains, the buffalo, the great rivers, the mountains, the storms, the people they had met. The younger travelers listened. They were building their own memories now. Perhaps one day they would tell these stories to their children. They would say, "We crossed the mountains. We slept beside the rivers. We watched the sun rise over the plains. We followed the trail west. And eventually we reached Oregon." But that day had not yet come. There were still many miles ahead. The Columbia River waited. The Oregon country waited. The final mountains waited. And between them stood the trail. The following morning, the wagon train moved again. The landscape gradually became greener. At first, only small changes appeared: more plants, more trees, more water. Then the differences became clearer. The air felt cooler. The soil looked richer. The mountains appeared darker. The travelers began to sense that they were entering a different climate. The West was changing again. The farther they traveled toward the Columbia country, the more the landscape reminded them that they were approaching the Pacific Northwest. Rain would become more important. Forests would become thicker. The dry country would gradually give way to greener valleys. For travelers who had spent weeks crossing dry landscapes, the sight of dense vegetation could feel almost unbelievable. They had come from the open prairie. They had crossed mountains. They had traveled through dry country. Now the landscape was becoming lush again. The children noticed first. They saw more trees, more green, more shade. The adults noticed the water. Streams were appearing more frequently. The land seemed alive. The trail continued. The wagons rolled forward. The travelers could almost feel that the journey was entering its final stages. But the final stages would not necessarily be easy. The Columbia River could be difficult. The Cascade Mountains still stood ahead. The trail would eventually require careful navigation. Some travelers would choose river routes. Others would continue overland. The destination was closer. But closer did not mean easy. Still, hope had grown stronger. Oregon no longer felt like an idea floating somewhere beyond the horizon. It was beginning to feel real, a place that could actually be reached. One evening, a family sat beside their wagon. The father looked at the remaining supplies. The mother looked toward the west. The children were talking about what they would do when they arrived. One wanted to explore. Another wanted a garden. Someone wanted to see the ocean. They had never seen it. The idea of an enormous body of water beyond the mountains seemed almost impossible. The family talked quietly. Then they ate dinner. The fire burned. The sun disappeared. The stars came out. And the travelers slept. Tomorrow they would continue. The trail was still long. But for the first time, the end was beginning to feel close. Not close enough to touch. Not close enough to see. But close enough to imagine clearly. And sometimes, imagination is enough to carry a person through another day. So the wagon train moved west beneath the morning sun. The wheels turned. The animals walked. The people followed. Behind them lay thousands of miles. Ahead lay Oregon. And somewhere beyond the next ridge, beyond the next river, beyond the next difficult stretch of trail, waited the new beginning they had traveled so far to find. The country grew greener as the wagon train moved west. At first, the change was so gradual that nobody paid much attention. A few more shrubs appeared beside the trail, then more trees. Streams became easier to find. The air felt cooler in the mornings. The dry dust of the earlier journey was less constant. The travelers began to notice the difference. They had spent so long crossing open and dry country that the sight of thick vegetation felt almost luxurious. A family might stop beneath a large tree simply because the shade was pleasant. Children could wander among bushes and flowers. Animals found better grazing. The land seemed generous again, but the trail was still demanding. The travelers had learned not to mistake beauty for ease. The Columbia country contained its own difficulties. The route toward Oregon could be rough. The terrain could change quickly. Forests could make travel difficult. Fallen trees could block the path. Mud could slow the wagons. Rivers could become dangerous. And the closer the travelers came to their destination, the more they wanted to reach it. That desire could make patience harder. After months on the road, everyone was tired, shoes were worn thin, clothes were faded. Wagons showed signs of constant use. Animals were no longer as strong as they had been in the spring. The travelers themselves had changed. They had become leaner, stronger, more experienced, but also deeply tired. A journey of many months leaves a mark on the body. The people had learned how to sleep almost anywhere. They could prepare meals quickly. They could repair equipment. They could wake before sunrise without complaint. They could walk for miles. They had become travelers in a way they had never expected. And now the end was approaching. One morning, the wagon train entered a forested section of the trail. Tall trees rose around them. Their branches created patches of shade. Sunlight fell through the leaves in moving patterns. The air smelled of damp earth and wood. Birdsong echoed among the trees. The wagon wheels made a different sound here. Instead of rolling across open dirt, they passed over roots, stones, and uneven ground. The travelers had to slow down. The forest was beautiful, but it required care. A fallen tree could block a wagon. A narrow opening could make turning difficult. Branches could catch the wagon covers. People walked ahead to examine the path. Sometimes they had to clear obstacles. Axes became important. A few people would cut branches. Others would move stones. The work took time. But after everything they had already crossed, another obstacle was simply another task. The travelers worked together. One person cut, another pulled, another guided the wagon. The animals waited. Eventually the path opened. The wagon moved forward. The forest swallowed the sound of the wheels. For a while the trail felt enclosed. The travelers could not see far ahead. They had to trust the route. Then suddenly the trees opened. A broad valley appeared. The travelers stopped. The view was beautiful. Green hills stretched toward the horizon. A river reflected the sky. The air felt moist. The land seemed fertile. For many immigrants, this was the first moment when Oregon began to look like the place they had imagined. The idea of a new home no longer seemed abstract. Here was land, green land, water, trees, fields. A future could be built here. People stared. Some smiled. Some became emotional. After months of hardship, the sight could feel overwhelming. But there was still a final distance to travel. The wagon train continued. The Columbia River became increasingly important. The river was enormous compared with many of the streams they had crossed. Its broad waterway moved through the landscape toward the Pacific. For travelers approaching Oregon, the river was a major geographical landmark. But it was not simply a beautiful river. It could be dangerous. Strong currents, changing water levels, rocks, weather, all required caution. Some travelers would use boats or other river transportation when available. Others continued overland. The choices depended on conditions, equipment, and circumstances. The important thing was that the destination was now within reach. The travelers could almost feel the journey ending, yet the trail still demanded attention. One evening, the wagon train camped near the river. The sound of flowing water filled the night. It was a powerful sound, constant, deep, peaceful. A traveler lying beneath the wagon cover could listen to the river for hours. After months of wagon wheels, animal footsteps, wind, and dust, the river provided a different rhythm. Water moving over rocks, water touching the shore, water continuing west. Perhaps a traveler wondered where that water had come from. Perhaps from mountains they had crossed. Perhaps from streams they had passed weeks earlier. All those waters had joined together. Now they were flowing toward the ocean. The thought could be strangely comforting. The travelers had crossed the continent. The rivers had done the same thing in their own way. They too were moving west. That evening, the family sat beside the river. The children were quieter than usual. Everyone seemed to understand that the journey was nearing its end. The father looked at the water. The mother looked toward the dark hills. There was still work to do. A home would need to be built. Land would need to be chosen. Food would need to be planted or found. The journey might be ending. Life was not. In some ways, the hardest work was only beginning. But it would be a different kind of work. The work of settling, growing, building, living. For tonight, however, they were still travelers. The river flowed. The fire burned. The stars appeared. The children slept. The adults remained awake a little longer. There was something emotional about the quiet. They had left one home months ago. They were about to create another. The distance between those two homes could be measured in thousands of miles. But the emotional distance was even greater. The people who had left were not the same people who had arrived. They had experienced uncertainty. They had faced weather. They had crossed rivers. They had climbed mountains. They had watched animals become exhausted. They had repaired broken wagons. They had helped strangers. They had lost things. They had gained memories, and they had continued. The next morning, the trail moved onward. The landscape became increasingly green. The air carried the scent of forests. The travelers saw more signs of settlement. Occasionally, they encountered people who already lived in the region. They learned more about the surrounding country. They heard about nearby valleys, rivers, farms, trading posts. The world was becoming more connected again. After months of isolation, even a distant house could seem remarkable. A fence, a cultivated field, a chimney, a person riding a horse. These ordinary signs of settled life reminded the immigrants that they were entering another world. The journey across the continent was nearly complete, but one final obstacle remained: the Cascades. The Cascade Mountains stood between the travelers and the Willamette Valley. They were not as unfamiliar as the Rockies had been, but they could still be difficult. The terrain was rugged, the forests were thick, the trail could be challenging. Some travelers approached the mountains with exhaustion rather than fear. They had already crossed so much. Another mountain range seemed almost unfair, yet they continued. The wagons moved slowly through the forest. The trees were tall, the ground was damp, the trail twisted, rain sometimes fell. The wagon covers became wet. The animals slipped occasionally on muddy ground. The travelers worked carefully. They knew they were close. That knowledge made every obstacle feel both frustrating and meaningful. A traveler might think, we have come this far. We cannot stop now, so they continued. One difficult slope, then another, one stream, then another, one day, then another. Eventually, the trail began descending, the land opened. The travelers could see farther, the air felt different. The valley below appeared green and wide. The Willamette Valley. For many travelers, this was the moment they had dreamed about. Oregon, not the distant idea. Not the name on a map. Not the destination discussed around a winter fireplace. The actual land, the land they had traveled thousands of miles to reach. The wagon train stopped. People looked. Some were silent, some laughed, some cried, some simply stood beside their wagons. The children did not fully understand the meaning of the moment. They only knew that the adults were unusually quiet. The valley stretched before them. Green fields, trees, rivers, mountains in the distance. A place where a new life could begin. The trail had brought them here, but the journey was not quite finished. They still had to reach their chosen destinations. They still had to unload, still had to find land, still had to build. But something important had changed. They were no longer traveling toward Oregon, they were in Oregon. The long journey into the unknown had become a new beginning. That evening, the family made one of their final camps as travelers. The sun went down over the valley, the fire burned. The animals rested, the wagon stood quietly. The same sounds that had accompanied them for months were still there. Wood creaking, fire crackling, wind moving through the grass. But somehow the sounds felt different. Tomorrow would not be another day of endless westward travel. Tomorrow would be the beginning of settlement. The road behind them was long. The road ahead would become a different kind of journey. For tonight, they could simply rest. They had crossed a continent. They had followed a trail into the unknown. And now, beneath the quiet Oregon sky, they had finally arrived. The morning after reaching the Willamette Valley felt almost ordinary. The sun rose, birds called from the trees. A light breeze moved through the grass, the animals waited beside the wagons. And yet nothing was quite the same. For months, the morning had always meant one thing: pack the wagon, harness the animals, follow the trail, move west. But there was no longer a distant west to chase. The travelers had reached Oregon. For some families, the realization may have taken time. They had spent so long imagining arrival that the actual moment could feel strangely quiet. There was no great ceremony, no trumpet, no official announcement, just a valley beneath the morning sky, green land, water, trees, and a family standing beside a wagon, knowing that this was where their new life would begin. The first task was choosing where to settle. Some travelers already had plans. Others had heard about particular areas during the journey. Some would settle near rivers. Others preferred open land. Some wanted forests. Some wanted fertile soil. Every family had different hopes. A person who had spent months thinking about Oregon might already have a picture in mind: a small house, a field, a garden, perhaps an orchard, perhaps animals, perhaps a quiet place where children could grow up. But turning that dream into reality required work. The wagon had carried the family this far. Now it had to become part of the new settlement. Supplies were unloaded, tools were removed, barrels opened, blankets unfolded, cooking equipment arranged. The wagon, once the center of their entire existence, slowly became simply a wagon again. That change was symbolic. For months, the wagon had been home. Now the land would become home. The family had to build. There was timber to gather, land to clear, food to prepare, a shelter to construct, water to locate, animals to care for. Nothing about arrival meant that life suddenly became easy. In fact, the work of settlement could be exhausting, but it was a different kind of exhaustion. The trail had demanded constant movement. Settlement demanded patience and construction. The pioneers could finally think beyond tomorrow. They could begin thinking about next season, next year, the years after that. They could plant, build, improve, grow. The future was no longer hidden behind thousands of miles. It was now directly in front of them. One of the first things a family might do was establish a simple shelter. It did not need to be beautiful, it needed to be useful. A roof, walls, a place to sleep, a place to store supplies, a place to cook. The first home might be temporary. Over time, it could become larger. A better house could be built. A garden could be planted, trees could be cleared, fences could be made. The wilderness could slowly become a farm. This process was repeated by thousands of families. Across the Oregon country, small settlements developed. Each began with people arriving after long journeys. Each family brought its own story. Some came from Missouri, some from Illinois, some from other parts of the United States. Some had traveled alone, others came in large groups. They arrived carrying different hopes, but they shared something important. They had crossed the trail. The Oregon Trail itself remained. Behind the new settlers, more wagon trains were already moving west. The trail did not stop simply because one family had arrived. Every year, more people would begin the journey. More wagons would roll across the plains. More children would see the mountains. More families would cross the rivers. The great movement west continued. But for the family we have followed tonight, the road had become a memory. They could now look back and realize how far they had traveled. Perhaps one evening, after the work of settlement was done, they would sit outside their new home. Sunset would spread across the valley. The air would be cool. A small fire would burn nearby. They might talk about the old home, the place they had left months earlier. They might remember the first morning, the first river, the first mountain, the long days on the plains, the nights beneath the stars, the difficult crossings, the moments when they wondered whether they could continue. And then they would look around at the trees, the fields, the valley, their children, their new home, and they might realize that the journey had become part of them. The Oregon Trail was not simply a road. It was an experience that changed people. It taught them how large the country was. It showed them how dependent people were on one another. It reminded them that nature could not be controlled. It taught patience. It taught endurance. It taught gratitude. A person who had spent months watching water carefully might never waste it again. A person who had walked beside exhausted animals might never think of animals as mere tools. A person who had slept beneath the stars might never look at the night sky in quite the same way. The trail changed ordinary things. A cup of water became precious. A warm meal became precious. A dry blanket became precious. A working wheel became precious. A peaceful evening became precious. The hardships gave meaning to the simple comforts. And perhaps that is one of the quiet lessons hidden inside the Oregon Trail story. People often imagine the great adventure, the mountains, the rivers, the wagon trains, frontier. But the deeper story is about ordinary people learning to appreciate ordinary things. After crossing thousands of miles, a family might sit in their new home and enjoy something they once took for granted. A wooden chair, a warm room, a solid roof, a garden, a quiet evening. These things felt different after the trail. The journey also created a connection between places. The road from Missouri to Oregon became part of the history of the United States. It connected communities. It carried letters. News, goods, families, ideas, dreams. It became one of the major routes through which Americans moved west. The trail existed long before the modern highways that would eventually cross the continent. Today, much of the route is hidden beneath roads, farms, towns, and cities. But traces remain, ruts in the earth, historical markers, old river crossings, sections of trail preserved in the landscape, places where travelers once stopped. Standing in such a place today, it can be difficult to imagine the original scene. There may be a road nearby, cars may pass, modern buildings may stand in the distance, but if you look carefully, you can sometimes imagine the old trail, a wagon, an ox, a family walking, dust rising behind them, the enormous sky, the slow movement west. The Oregon Trail has become part of the American imagination because it represents more than migration. It represents uncertainty, the willingness to leave the familiar, the hope of finding something better, the courage to travel toward a place that had never been seen. But it also represents the complicated reality of westward expansion. The land was not empty. Native nations had lived across these regions for generations. They had their own communities, cultures, languages, trade networks, histories. The arrival of large numbers of immigrants changed those landscapes forever. The Oregon Trail therefore belongs to a larger and more complicated history. It was a road of opportunity for some, but it also became part of a period of profound change and displacement for native peoples. The travelers on the wagons often thought of themselves simply as families searching for a future, but their movement was part of a much larger transformation of the American West. That history deserves to be remembered carefully. And so, when we imagine the Oregon Trail tonight, we can imagine the families and their hopes while also remembering the people who already called these lands home. The landscape had stories long before the wagons arrived. The rivers had names. The mountains had names. The valleys had histories. The forests were not empty. The West was not waiting for history to begin. History was already there. The wagon trails became another layer in a much older story. As evening settles over Oregon, imagine the family sitting outside their new home. The journey is over. The wagon stands nearby. Its wheels are dusty. Its wood is worn. The canvas has been repaired many times. It looks tired. But it has done its work. It carried the family across the continent. Now it can rest. Animals graze nearby. The children play. A small garden has begun. The house is simple. Perhaps the walls are still unfinished. Perhaps the roof leaks a little. Perhaps there is still much work to do. But it is home. The sun lowers. The valley becomes golden. The mountains turn purple. A river reflects the evening light. The family sits quietly. Nobody needs to hurry. There is no need to wake early for another long day on the trail. Tomorrow will bring work. But it will be local work. A garden, a fence, a field, a house. There will be seasons now, spring, summer, autumn, winter. The family will watch the landscape change. They will learn new weather patterns. They will plant crops. They will build relationships with neighbors. They will become part of the place. And eventually, the Oregon Trail will become a story they tell. A story about the time they crossed the country. A story about the mountains. A story about the rivers. A story about the nights beneath the stars. A story about how far they walked. A story about how difficult it was. And a story about how they kept going. The final night of our journey is quiet. The sky is darkening. The fire is low. The children are asleep. The animals are resting. The wagon stands silently beside the house. The same stars that watched over the family on the plains now shine above their new home. The same moon that rose over the rivers and mountains now rises over Oregon. The journey has changed location, but the sky remains the same. Perhaps that is one of the most beautiful thoughts about the Oregon Trail. The travelers crossed enormous distances beneath one continuous sky. They woke beneath it. They walked beneath it. They rested beneath it. They dreamed beneath it. And finally, they arrived beneath it. The long journey into the unknown became a new beginning. And somewhere far behind them, the trail continued. Other families were still traveling. Other wagons were still moving. Other children were still looking toward the mountains. Other parents were still wondering what waited beyond the horizon. The road never belonged to one family alone. It became a shared thread in American history, a long line stretching across the continent, a path made by countless footsteps and wagon wheels, a road of hope, a road of uncertainty, a road of hardship, a road of memory. And tonight we have traveled it slowly, from the quiet farms of the east across the endless plains, beside the Platte River toward Fort Laramie into the Rocky Mountains, through South Pass, across the dry country, along the rivers of the West, toward the Columbia, through the final mountains, and finally into the green valleys of Oregon. The journey took months, but the memory could last a lifetime. The fire beside the new home burns lower. The valley is quiet. The night is cool. A gentle breeze moves through the trees. The family sleeps, and the old wagon rests beneath the stars. There is nowhere else it needs to go. For now, the trail is finished. The unknown has become home, and the long journey has finally come to an end. Good night.